Welcome back into the Daily Dose. I'm your host, Jeff Hansen. As always, the show is brought to you by Give'emHellBrigham.com and by CougarSportsInsider.com, part of the 24/7 Sports Network. If you've not done so yet, please take a minute, subscribe to the channel. Helps us grow this platform, and you don't want to miss a second of the action of what we've got prepared here all offseason and into the season. This is going to be the premier place for BYU content, regardless of what polo or what BYU gear I am or am not wearing in the moment. That's been brought up in the comments. My wardrobe has been the subject of a lot of conversation, both good and bad. And here we are. I'm just a middle-aged balding man. I mean, I don't really know what else to say about it. They're shirts. But no matter whether I have a BYU logo on my shirt or not, this is the premier place for BYU content. That much I can assure you. Today, let's talk about Zach Wilson. Why? Because his little brother, Isaac Wilson, four-star quarterback, Elite 11 finalist now as of yesterday, he just committed to the University of Utah. The Wilson fairy tale of the once die-hard season ticket holders, red-blooded University of Utah fans who turned blue in order to support their son, Zach, as he went to BYU, chose the rival school, and ultimately ended up in the NFL. That fairy tale is over. They're back in red. They're back at Rice-Eccles Stadium. They are back at their home in Salt Lake City, up on the hill. Isaac Wilson commits to the Utes over BYU and a number of other schools, and that's where he will play out his college football career. That sucks. That's a bummer. BYU will be okay. There's other quarterbacks that BYU is going to be able to find. We've talked about quarterbacks on this show as recently as this week. BYU's fine. But it's a bummer. It's a bummer to lose that fairy tale. The Wilson family has been so great for BYU. It's a bummer that they are headed to Utah now from a BYU perspective. There's no question about that. But that doesn't take away what has already happened, and it doesn't take away the influence and the legacy of Zach Wilson during his time at BYU. I was asked a question this morning by Robbie McCombs of VanquishTheFoe.com, and he said, hey, do you think that Kalani Sitake is even the head coach at BYU if Zach Wilson never comes? And I think that's a really fascinating question. The answer is probably not. If we get into our hot tub time machine and we go back to 2017, the Cougars are coming off one of the worst seasons that they've ever had. Maybe the worst season that they've ever had. Certainly the worst season since Lavelle Edwards took over as head coach back in the 70s. The offensive metrics were abysmal across the board. Whether you wanted advanced metrics, whether you wanted wins and losses, whether you wanted just plain a regular box score points per game, BYU was dreadful. They had games against LSU where they never crossed the 50-yard line, and ultimately the season was culminated and highlighted by a home loss on senior day against the University of Massachusetts in Provo inside Lavelle Edwards Stadium. That game was a low point for the program. After the season is over, Kalani Sitake has to make some really difficult decisions. Ty Detmer, an absolute BYU legend, is dismissed from the program as offensive coordinator, and his staff, which was primarily made up of former BYU players, alumni, they were also dismissed, and BYU went in an entirely different direction. Kalani took a lot of heat for that. Kalani took a lot of heat for that. A lot of people said that he made Ty a scapegoat, and maybe that's true, maybe that's not. I think if you look at the metrics, I think it's pretty clear that a change needed to be made at offense, and scapegoat or not, that's the purview of the head coach. They can make somebody a scapegoat if they want to. So Kalani makes that decision. Ty Detmer goes away, and now we're into a new era of BYU football. One of the first things that happens after that decision is made, Ty Detmer's nephew, Zadok Dinkelman, who had been committed in the class of, I guess, 2018 at the time, he decommits from BYU. He was a former LSU commit who then flipped to BYU. Never really saw his recruiting take off after it got off to a hot start early in his career. But Dinkelman backed off of his BYU pledge, and BYU had no quarterbacks committed on their recruiting class in the class of 2018. Jeff Grimes takes the offensive coordinator position. Aaron Roderick comes in as the quarterbacks coach. Kalani Sitake, who's always been a big fan of Zach Wilson, starts working with the Wilson family, and ultimately they are able to come in to the picture late and say, hey, Zach, we think that we're sorry we've messed up your recruiting so far, but we think that this is the place for you and you can do great things. And to the credit of Zach Wilson, he listened. He didn't have to listen. BYU had botched that recruitment. They hadn't given him any attention, the time of day whatsoever. He was not a BYU fan. He had grown up an ardent supporter of BYU's biggest rival. There was no reason for him to go to Provo. He had Power 5 offers at the time. He was committed to Boise State when those Power 5 offers started coming in. Zach Wilson did not have to come to BYU. And then you look, and BYU was coming off of a 4-9 season. The head coach was firmly on the hot seat, and the offensive coordinator who was coming into the program had never called plays or been a coordinator before. Zach Wilson was walking into a miserable situation, and yet he did it anyways. 2018 rolls around, and BYU has a lot of momentum early. They knock off Wisconsin. They have some great moments with the element of surprise. They beat Arizona to start the season. Tanner Mangum is effective, although not spectacular. BYU is able to work around Tanner Mangum and win a few ball games to start the season. But it's clear in those first 4 or 5 games that Tanner Mangum's not the long-term solution at quarterback. And what BYU was doing to start the season was gimmicky. It had a shelf life. Jeff Grimes could not roll out that offense for 12 or 13 games in a season. He needed more life. He needed more juice. He needed more from his quarterback. So they made a change after a disappointing loss to Utah State. Mid-game, they changed to Zach Wilson, and he never looks back. Zach Wilson, he goes up and down during his true freshman season. He battles injuries the next year. He had an up and down early start to his career, but the talent was always there. And ultimately, we know and we remember what Zach did in 2020, having one of the most efficient and effective quarterback seasons in BYU football history. I mean, that's a rich football history. Names like McMahon, Detmer, Young. Zach Wilson was up there with the best of them. If that doesn't happen, if Zach Wilson looks at BYU and says, no, you guys didn't recruit me, I'm not coming, I'm not sure that Kalani Sitake is in Provo today. I'm not sure that BYU would have been able to recover in 2018 to the point that fans were feeling confident going into 2019. If BYU has to roll with Tanner Mangum for 12 games in 2018, they're not making a bowl game. And I don't think that I don't think Kalani Sitake survives back-to-back seasons without a bowl game. I think Zach Wilson is the reason that Kalani Sitake is still employed today. Now, obviously, to Kalani's credit, Kalani capitalized on that momentum, and now he has built BYU into a very sustainable program, and it looks great. His vision when he went through the rocky parts in 2017 and by playing a lot of youth, his vision has started to come to fruition, and BYU is doing well. But college football doesn't usually give people that kind of a leash. Zach Wilson is the reason that Kalani had that kind of a leash in Provo. So Isaac Wilson's off to Utah, and that's a bummer for any BYU fan, but that doesn't erase what Zach Wilson did for the program. Zach Wilson was a BYU legend, and our head coach today, Kalani Sitake, is absolutely the right man to lead BYU into the Big 12. And thankfully, Zach came to BYU so that Kalani is that man leading BYU into the Big 12. Once again, thank you for the support. If you haven't done so yet, please subscribe to the channel. And until next time, give them hell.